We can just put it here, right? Just leave it here. Yeah. We're
That's what
taping
you're
it in
recording
two
of.
different ways, so we have a fail safe.
Okay.
Okay, I think we're going to get started. Just to give you a couple pieces of logistical information, we're having another reception. As I said in the email that you all should have received by now, instead of what the formal sit-down dinner, the reception is going to be at exactly the same place where we had it yesterday. It's going to be fairly similar. I changed the wines, but other than that, it's going to be fairly similar to what we did yesterday. And then people are free to do whatever they want. Many of you have indicated that you wanted the freedom to do go to DC if you felt like it today and all that. I'm not in a very good position to recommend places that are lively and active and all that. So I asked somebody younger than I am to give me some recommendations, and they're all written down on that sheet of paper that is on top of that table. So if you want any recommendations of what are considered to be very nice hotspots in DC, there's a list of recommendations from somebody much younger than I am. So, and if you have questions, there are a number of people here who can help you. DC is very close if you go by Uber, or you can take the metro. And College Park is not the kind of university town that has a lot of good restaurants. It has primarily bars to drink beer, and that's pretty much it. So if you want to go to an interesting restaurant, you need to go out of the area. So it gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce Immanuel Wallerstein. I'm not going to spend much time introducing him because you all know him very well. I feel particularly proud to be hosting the 40th anniversary of the PEWS meeting, which I think it speaks not only to the tremendous intellectual impact that Emmanuel's work has had and the sort of lasting dialogue that we've been having over all different dimensions of the world system's perspective, but I think it also speaks to the tremendous energy he has had to sustain the institutional effort of building this community and bringing us together on a recurrent basis and getting the volumes published based on the papers presented at the conferences and so forth. And I think that his work in helping build this community has also been of tremendous importance, invaluable. And I would also like to acknowledge Beatrice, because she is also a regular part of these get-togethers, and she is always tremendously engaged with everything that we're discussing and everything that is being presented. So she is also very much a part of our little, maybe not so little community. So I'll leave it at that. Emmanuel is going to talk on opening the social sciences, looking back and looking forward.
As I listened to a series of papers today, which were theoretically informed and sophisticated and methodologically very complicated and using methods which I didn't really understand. At many points I felt like a dodo, and I was wondering why I was invited to do this, and I've decided that the real reason is it's deference to age, since I'm the oldest person here. And I'm going to talk from the point of view of the advantages of age. I think there's only one person, Wally Goldfrank, who was at the first PEWS. I don't know if there's anyone else in the audience. Yes. Okay, two people. But one of the advantages of age, right, is that people don't tend to realize that what looks very negative from today's perspective, looked very positive at an earlier point in time. And they ignore that the positive is in fact what breeds the negative, which breeds new positives. So I'm going to try to review the kind of history as I saw it, that's all, as I saw it, of discussion of historical social change, or what's going on in the world, and as a series of questions which are both intellectual and practical. Now, let's start with right after the Second World War. Something came into existence called area studies, and we have now had so much debunking of area studies, it's not worth wasting our time. But area studies seemed to us at the time a very positive advance, because it took seriously the possibility that other parts of the world other than Western Europe or the pan-European world could be fully, quote, modern in some sense. And it stimulated a concern with these parts of the world as they existed in the present time, and not assuming that they were, how shall I say, hopelessly backward. So it was a very positive thing, and it led to a whole series of consequences, which in fact we tried to trace in Open the Social Sciences, this little book, the report of the Gulbenkian condition. We tried to explain why it was that people began to engage in area studies. Now, if you move a little bit forward in time to the creation of PEWS. As PEWS, we are at the 40th meeting, which means that the first meeting was 1976. But how many of you have thought about why was there a meeting in 1976? Where did it come from? And that's because you don't know that there was a meeting in 1975, which has never been written up, and it's almost secret history. But the meeting in 1975 was the consequence of Terry Hopkins and me trying to get some more discussion going on the origins of the modern world. And we felt that these big questions had been discussed in the 19th century, but then they just sort of dropped out of discussion arena. And we persuaded Chuck Tilley to join us in an application to the American Sociological Association. They gave little grants, forget the name of it, but they gave little grants for innovative meetings. And we got a grant of $2,000. $2,000. Even in the lower expenses of those days, $2,000 wasn't very much. And we had a meeting at Northwestern University because we had someone there who would host us, and we invited people like Douglas North, Theda Scotchpole, all sorts of people, but 10 or I don't even remember how many, but surely not more than 15, to present alternative views to each other about the origins of the modern world. And we all found the meeting very useful for us intellectually, but of course there were very wide differences of approach to this question. And it was said, well, maybe we should meet again. And then came the practical question. Yeah, but who will finance that? This one was financed for $2,000, but at least it was a little bit of money. But we said, well, maybe we should since there seemed to be more sociologists in this meeting, that was perhaps because of whom we invited, than in others, maybe we should meet at the time of the next American Sociological meeting. This was a practical consideration. And so I organized a meeting. I chaired a meeting called The Political Economy of the World System, I think. And again, the name was an issue. Actually, I personally thought that meeting was a disaster because people came to the meeting and started fighting about the premises of even having a meeting of this kind. But we then had another practical problem. One of the things we had said to each other at the meeting at Northwestern is we can't, on this important question, we have to ignore so-called disciplinary affiliations. And we invited people from different, how do we continue that if we meet at the American Sociological meetings? So then we got the idea that there would be two meetings, one at the annual meeting of the American Sociological, and one in the spring that would be not at but the PEWS meeting. This one is the 40th of those. The whole idea was to make it possible to have a meeting which wouldn't require people to be members of the American Sociological Association. So it's again a practical question, but we then had a practical question of money, and we had to go around and find people who could organize the meeting and raise some money on their own campuses to finance the possibility of having a meeting. So all these things kept shaping what we were doing. The Fernand Braudel Center gets invented at this time, and one of the things one of the agreements, in a sense, that we made when I moved to Binghamton to set up the Fernand Braudel Center with the administration, they didn't give us much money, but they gave us the possibility of having appointments in which we would somehow ignore the PhD origins of various people coming to the sociology department and the Fernand Braudel Center. And indeed, if you look at the early list, almost none of them had PhDs in sociology. They had PhDs in anthropology, in economic history, in I forget, 5 or 6 different political science and so forth. And so we were implementing the whole idea from the very beginning of ignoring the disciplinary boundaries and choosing people on the grounds that they were somehow interested in addressing the question of the modern world and its origins, the modern world in its mode of functioning. Now, we set up the Fernand Braudel Center with a mechanism called research working groups, and that in itself was a deliberate kind of organizational innovation in which we said, look, we're going to bring together faculty and graduate students who would meet every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks, and they would take an initial topic of interest, and they would work on defining what it was about the topic that really interested them, and then they were going to meet, and they were going to treat the topic over long historical time, which we defined, depending on the topic, differently, but usually from the 16th century to today. And we were going to assign different roles to different people, and they would have to bring in and report to the larger group, who would say, no, you're missing the point, or you're moving in a different direction, so that we were having a group which over a 5-7 year period would indeed result in some kind of collective report, which would be perhaps with chapters whose authors said to be different, but which would read as a single continuous document. Right? And that would be only a broaching of a subject that was worthy of further detailed research. So this whole mechanism kind of created a sort of fire that pushed off in many different directions. Now, I was interested in this effort we made to create some positive points. I was interested in the first session today. Let's see, on scope and methods, right? And it seemed to me that everybody in that first session was telling us what we had left out. Not what we had left in, but what we had left out, right? They were all saying we should have been studying, or we should be studying more intensively. David Baronoff said the relation of analytic and holistic approaches. Antonio Gelis Filio said geoculture is an underanalyzed idea. Eric Milans and Ramon Grafol said civilizations are not really discussed, and that's very important. Tom Hall said, as he's been saying for years, the indigenous peoples are not studied, and therefore we don't understand what incorporation is or is not, and so forth. So it's it was all a self-critical view, right? We had forgotten things. We had to add things, and in some ways that's extremely helpful. In some ways, it's reasonably difficult. Now, where does this come from? Open the Social Sciences, the report of the Gulbenkian Commission on the Restructuring of the Social Sciences. Well, again, a practical thing. There we were at Binghamton with the Fernand Braudel Center, and we wanted to have projects, and we wanted to raise money. And one of the best places to raise money at that time, and is still today, the National Science Foundation. Now, I don't know if all of you know how the National Science Foundation really operates, as opposed to what it operates on paper. The way it really operates is that there are staff people. And if you don't have the staff person on your side, don't bother applying. So you've got to cultivate the staff people and persuade them that you're reasonably interesting and reasonably relevant and worth supporting. At which point you write up a project, keeping in mind these staff people, and they submit this project for evaluation by people they select, although you can suggest to them possible people that they might ask, but they select them, and then they get in reports. And then we noticed a very curious thing. Most projects who get in are either, how should I say, have lots of people who reject them, or lots of people who accept them. We exceptionally, it was quite exceptional, always had split reports. If there were 4 outside readers, 2 would be enthusiastic about the originality of the ideas, about the hopefulness of all this, and 2 would be totally denunciatory and say it's an absolute waste of time, it's pure journalism, or it's just politics disguised as scholarship and so forth. So there we were, and we get and of course they had a hard time dealing with this. We had a hard time dealing with this, but we immediately began to worry about the epistemological questions as a result of this. And we said, obviously there is a real split in how people look at the world. So we tried in various ways to begin working it on itself, and we came up with the idea of seeing whether we could obtain an intelligent analysis of the history of the structure, what we came to call the structures of knowledge. And so we had a discussion with the Gulbenkian Commission, the Gulbenkian Foundation, with who had a science department. It's a side issue how the Gulbenkian Foundation is organized. It's a very complicated, very unusual structure itself. But in any case, we persuaded this key staff person of the usefulness of such a study, and we said we would do a study on the restructuring of the social sciences. And we came up with the idea again, an idea to give us the appropriate base for this, that we wanted people from different disciplines. And we said, okay, it's about the social sciences. We should have a 10-member group, because that's the maximum we can possibly handle in a serious way. And 6 of them should come from the social sciences, but 2 of them should come from the humanities, and 2 of them should come from the natural sciences, in order to have different perspectives on what's going on in the social sciences. And then we said we should have people who are from different parts of the world and from different linguistic groups. And then we said, and different nationalities. And then we said, but they should all be somehow open to the idea of looking at the basic epistemological issues. Well, if you start to try to put those combinations together, you run into a lot of difficulties about fulfilling all the categories. And we didn't, but we filled as many as we could, and we did create a condition with that 6-2-2 operation, and that group met 3 times, a year apart each time. That's what the money of the Gulbenkian Foundation permitted us to do, and the first time that we did it, everybody sort of said their thing and argued with each other, and we resolved only a marginal amount of things. And we said, okay, we'll now ask each of you to write up X and bring it back to the second meeting. And people wrote up X and brought it back to the second meeting, and now we were criticizing each other, but trying to pull that together. And then at the end of that, I was asked to draft a version that would somehow meet the requirements of all 10 members, because we wanted an absolute unanimous report on which every member was ready to sign that version. And that took a lot of doing, because we came back to the third meeting And again, you get 10 people together, they're different kinds of personalities. So there were those who spoke very little, and there were those who read every sentence and pulled each sentence practically to our attention. And then we had to negotiate certain tricky sentences and so forth. And then we had to, we finally had a draft, and then we, I'm trying to remember the sequence now. We sent out this draft report to maybe 50 people, and we got in some very interesting comments. And then we needed to get it published. And one of the members of our commission, who was it? Just a minute. Yes. Mudimbi. Mudimbi, who was a Zaïrois and who was French-speaking and so forth, had an arrangement with Stanford to publish a series that he would be the editor of, and he wanted them to publish this. And then we had a big argument with the staff person there, because the staff person there thought that she knew cultural studies far better than the commission did, and she wanted to be able to correct our errors. And I said, you can't change a single word in that, because we argued about every single word in there, and this is the only version that all 10 people will sign. And she gave in very reluctantly to that. But again, you see the practical problems that one comes up against in terms of furthering the analysis. Now, in one sense, this report is an enormous success, in the very simple sense that it has been translated into approximately 30 languages. How many texts in English do you know that have been translated into Lithuanian? I mean, you know, it's a real achievement. And furthermore, this text gets cited all over the place, but least of all in the United States and Great Britain, or England, right? So immediately you have a differential reception for a report like this. And then one has to say, how much difference did this kind of report actually make if it didn't get reviewed or even read or even purchased in the United States? I don't know how many libraries in the United States have a copy of that, because this is also the point in time when libraries are cutting back on buying books of various kinds. Well, at this point, one has to take into account Ilya Prigozhin. Now, again, my contacts with Prigozhin were in some sense originally accidental. I was invited to a meeting by, I forget which big corporation, some big world corporation had the pattern of inviting middle-level cadres every year, different ones I suppose, to a meeting which they organized. They wanted to deepen their understanding of what was going on and so forth. And they came to me and said, would I come to this meeting just to be there in the audience. And I said, okay, I'll come to this meeting and be there in the audience. And then they came to me at the last minute and said, oh, one of our speakers has fallen through. Would you give a talk? Now, before me at that meeting was Ilya Prigozhin. And Ilya Prigozhin, of whom I had never heard, to be honest, before that meeting, Nobel Prize in Chemistry and so forth and so on, gave a talk which, before I did, which absolutely floored me, because he was saying, or he was formulating things which I felt I'd been sort of struggling towards, and I heard him say it, and it clarified for me what I was thinking, but also I said, my God, here's a man who is saying things, he's a Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and he is rejecting everything that we are being criticized for by natural scientists in the United States or elsewhere. And he was talking about the arrow of time. He was talking about limited life of all structures and so forth. He was talking about, he was anti-Newtonian, anti-Cartesian, and he had a Nobel Prize in chemistry. And I said, gee, this is an immensely valuable ally. And then I was supposed to speak after him. And I went up to him and I said, I asked him to stay and listen to my paper. And he agreed to do that. And he liked my paper. And he started inviting me to his conferences. And his conferences were fascinating. And I can tell you one of the most fascinating conferences. He had one which he held in Texas because he had this joint appointment, and he was at the University of Texas half the year. And he had a conference in which he invited basically somebody from every conceivable discipline. So there were about 30 people, and it was on, what was it on? It was on innovation, I think. I don't remember exactly the theme of the conference, but there were 30 people from every conceivable discipline, from chemistry and physics to literary studies to everything in between, and so forth, mathematics, and so forth, and they each gave a talk. That was the mode of the conference, was they each gave a talk. And they were all knew that they were talking to an audience of many, many disciplines. And I could understand every one of the talks except one. The only one I couldn't understand was the one by the economist. Literally. And then I checked, and other people felt the same way. So then I said, gee, you know, what is it that explains that the economist speaks a language insisting that he is doing what everybody else is doing, and he doesn't hear the fact that he's not doing that? So that got us into where we go next. Now, some of the things that we did over time were attempts to answer questions. One of the critiques of concern with world system as it went on is, look, you say core, periphery, and so forth, but are these concepts you say core, semi-periphery, and periphery, and you put them on some kind of continuum. This is other people speaking. Put them on some kind of continuum, and then we go into analyses of whether there's more or less of this or that. And we say in response to that, or I say, because I don't know that we say, I say in response to that, you miss the point of core periphery. Core and periphery are not attributes which countries have, and therefore the argument that there are cores within peripheral countries and peripheries within core countries and so forth disproves your whole argument. We say, no, they're not attributes. They're not attributes, they are relations, right? And they are fundamentally different from semi-periphery, right? So if core periphery are relations, right, then they are core implies periphery, periphery implies core. They have no meaning other than as a relationship. What are they relating to, or how are they to be measured? And we worked on that, and we said, look, basically what we're measuring there in a core-periphery relationship is the degree of monopolization or non-monopolization, the freedom of the market versus the monopolized market. Because what you mean by a core is something which enables you to monopolize temporarily some product, which then requires what? It requires some kind of political structure which will allow you to monopolize, and then these are self-liquidating over time, okay? So what is a semi-periphery? A semi-periphery is not a relationship at all. It says that if you then analyze states, political units, and you say, what is the percentage of peripheral and core-like activities in that state, you will discover some states with a heavy percentage of core-like activities, some with a heavy percentage of peripheral, and some with somewhere in between. So they are states which can then act on the world political arena in an attempt to increase the percentages one way or the other. But that's not on the continuum of core to periphery. Why do we debate this today in something called PEWS? Well, in part, obviously, we were brought together and we've created a sort of subculture. We like each other, we find each other interesting, but we've got a lot of problems. For example, we have a very practical problem. It used to be very easy to organize a PEWS meeting. Why? Because there were people who felt they were ambitious, they were interested in it, and they found it very easy to come and beg to be the organizer of a PEWS meeting next year, the year after, the year after. And then came a very practical problem. Universities have less money these days. They have far less money. It's much harder for somebody to get the amount of, not enormous amount, but the amount of money needed to organize a meeting than was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. That's a practical problem. It has nothing to do with intellectual issues, right? It has to do with the structure of the university system and the fact of the expansion of the university system, which was one of the basic factors we used to explain what was going on in the world structures of knowledge after 1945. So one of the nice things about PEWS, and one of the surviving virtues of PEWS as a kind of cultural system, is, how shall I say, the Goldilocks feature. We are neither we define what comes within the nature of PEWS neither too narrowly nor too broadly. If you define it too narrowly, if you say you aren't interested in the political economy of the world system, or whatever you want to call it, you aren't interested in this unless you subscribe to A, B, and C, then what happens very quickly is that you become a sect. And you become a sect, you die out. If you define it too widely, and you say anybody who talks about development, for example, is interested in the political economy of the world system, then you're not. There's nothing there. There's no critical element in your analysis. So you've got to fight. We had a fight, for example, within PEWS 25 years ago of a chair who wanted to redefine it much more broadly, and we fought back, defeated this, right, in order to keep it in this Goldilocks position. But it ain't easy. It ain't easy because people are always pulling it in one direction or the other. That's an organizational reality. Now, what should we be doing in the future if this is somehow my analysis of the past? Where should we be going? Well, look, let's take the business. I think what we need is both more analytic clarity, right, and more, how shall I say, more cultural tolerance. We've got to be able to accept the intrusion of new elements, and there were new elements intruded today, and look at them without disdain, and yet understand that there's some kind of minimum price for entry. Now take, for example, the Four Chiefs, which was one of our very last discussions. I agree myself, right, with the Four Chiefs, but what's the consequence of the Four Chiefs, right? The consequence of the Four Chiefs, of the price of all these things going down, for all the good reasons that were suggested, is that the amount of money that is distributed to individuals throughout the system gets reduced radically. And that means there is no effective demand for any goods produced by anybody, which means, in effect, that capitalism cannot survive. Can't survive because it doesn't have people to buy the products. And everything is pushing in the direction of having fewer and fewer people to buy. The amount of real unemployment, as opposed to fake unemployment figures that everybody gives, has been going up steadily for a long time. And here we have to intrude the analysis. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but of Randy Collins' analysis of the crisis of the world system. He says, look, very simply, we have had technological change repeatedly. And each time we've had technological change, there's been a Luddite reaction to that. And the Luddite reaction never gets anywhere because it gets ignored, basically. And it's perfectly true what the defenders against Luddism say, which is as you kill off these bad jobs, these no longer jobs needed in this technique that's no longer needed, new jobs will be created over here. It's just the same individuals won't get them, but the new jobs will be created over here. But in fact, what has been happening is that more and more and more of the new jobs are. And it was always said that this could only happen in blue-collar jobs. Now, what's a blue-collar job? A blue-collar job is someone where someone works with a machine of some kind, and he can get eliminated by technological advance and so forth. But what's happened, what would never happen with white-collar jobs, because white-collar jobs are complex, they require interpersonal discussions with people, and you can't, how shall I say, quantify them and reduce them. But in point of fact, what's happened now is, this is Randy Collins speaking, what's happened now is that we have suddenly worked out the technology of immediately, how shall I say, quantifying and eliminating the need, that is reducing what takes 200 hours of discussion into 10 minutes of work, or 1 minute of work on a thing that used to be called white collar. And it's only at the lowest level of such white collar jobs which are being eliminated now, but bit by bit more and more will be as they move up the level. So what is happening is we no longer have the restorative effect of the white collar jobs replacing the blue collar jobs. The white collar jobs are being eliminated too. So as that happens, you have fewer and fewer and fewer people who have an income. And if you have fewer and fewer people that have an income, it makes no sense. This is part of my argument, that makes no sense for any capitalist to invest any money in it. So capitalism is no longer profitable to capitalists. And that's a crucial element, and that's a new element. Okay, so that brings us back to the Prigogine argument of systems have lives. And you have to explain why at a certain point you get systemic crisis, and just given some of the reasons why, and that then says then what happens. You're in an interim phase of systemic chaos, and systemic chaos is extremely confusing. It's confusing analytically, it's confusing intellectually, it's confusing emotionally, right? And so we look at this and we grab out in all directions, and that isn't terribly useful. But that's the problem that we're faced with. We're faced with a system in which the ups and downs, what do you call it? The can't even think of the word. The degree of Fluctuations, thank you very much. The degree of fluctuations are suddenly so enormous that there's nothing that brings it back to equilibrium. At which point, what do we have? We have a political struggle over, not over restoring capitalism as a system, but over what could possibly succeed capitalism. And I have put forward an argument about what I call the spirit of Porto Alegre and the spirit of Davos, the spirit of, because it's not an organization, but a movement, right? Fighting each other over this period, over which of the two prongs of a bifurcation the system will eventually take, because they always do take one of the prongs, at which point we're into a new system. And will that be better or worse than the present system? But in any case, it will be radically different. And there are various analytic possibilities of that. So when will that happen? Well, again, no one knows for sure, but it can't go on forever. And analytically, I say it's been going on now for 20, 30 years. It may go on for another 20, 30 years. I don't know. Approximately, maybe, who knows, but it will come to an end. And that brings us back to what? To a political question. So what are you doing about pushing the system in one direction or the other? And there I come to the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is that the butterfly flicks its wings at one end of the world, and at the other end, the far end of the world, as far away as possible, it changes the climate or the whatever, the trend, because it is changing the initial conditions under which it is going. So in that sense, I always end this talk with the concept of we are all little butterflies, because the system is made up of, we can't predict how many butterflies will move in one direction or the other, but the only way you affect it is by being a butterfly. We're all little butterflies. So I don't know how much clarity I have given you. For me, we are in a moment of systemic crisis that makes us in a moment of crisis in the structures of knowledge. The two crises are part of the same picture, but they each affect the other. And how we resolve the crisis in the structures of knowledge will affect how we really affect the overall crisis in the world system, and vice versa. So, shall I say, I think PEWS remains an important institution, but if it doesn't remain an important institution, we've got to create other PEWS-like institutions. I have, how shall I say, I have no sense of the need to keep the institution per se a survivor. So I trust I've confused you sufficiently, and I will submit myself to your questions.
Emmanuel?
Yeah, but you got to come up here.
I have a question.
I did not prompt her.
No, just an anecdote about the work on the
Banking Commission.
Gulbenkian Commission. You must realize that the people who came and worked on it were fairly busy people in their own lives, and therefore the idea of coming to Binghamton, New York for a meeting about something they weren't yet sure about was not exactly enticing. And one of the people who was hardest to get was Ilya Prigozhin. He had many obligations and he had a very full life. He was also a gentleman of a certain age and so on. And at first he said, "I'm not coming, that's ridiculous, I don't even know where Binghamton is, never heard of it," and so on. And I said to Emmanuel, offer him an honorary degree. And you must know that Prigozhin had enough honorary degrees to pay for this entire room. And lo and behold, and also Binghamton had not yet given an honorary degree to anyone, so they didn't know quite what to do. And lo and behold, he accepted the offer and he came. And not only that, but once the word filtered out through the village that Prigozhin was coming, he was invited to give a class at the local high school, and he did that too. Anyway, he's everybody's hero.
Any questions or comments?